Introduction. So Rome always wins because even if they lose battles, they go to the Italian allies and half-citizens and raise new armies. So how do you beat them? He can never raise that many troops himself. And Hannibal, I think, correctly figures out the one way to maybe defeat Rome is to cut them away from their allies. Well, how do you do this? Hannibal's plan is, I'm not gonna wait and fight the Romans in Spain or North Africa. I'm gonna invade Italy. So I'm gonna strike at the heart of this growing Roman Empire, and my hope is that if I can win a couple big battles against Rome in Italy, the Italians will want their freedom back, and they'll rebel from Rome and maybe even join me. Because most people who have been conquered want their freedom back, so this is a reasonable plan. So Hannibal famously crosses the Alps with elephants. Dramatic stuff. Nobody expects them to do this. Nobody thinks you can do this. Shows up in northern Italy, Romans send an army, Hannibal massacres them. He is a military genius. Rome takes a year, raises a second army, we know this story, sends it against Hannibal, Hannibal wipes him out. Rome gets clever this time. They say, okay, Hannibal's different. We're gonna take 2 years, raise 2 armies, and send them both out at the same time against Hannibal. So they do this, and this is the Battle of Cannae, which is one of the most famous battles in history. Hannibal is facing this army of 80,000 Romans about, and he comes up with strategy called double envelopment. I mean, we can go into it later if you want, but it's this famous strategy where he basically kind of sucks the Romans in, surrounds them on all sides, and in one afternoon, at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal kills about 60,000 Romans. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's more Romans hacked to death in one afternoon with swords than Americans died in 20 years in Vietnam. The following is a conversation with Gregory Aldrete, a historian specializing in ancient Rome and military history. This is Lex Fridman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Gregory Aldrete. Ancient world. What do you think is the big difference between the ancient world and the modern world? Well, the easy answer, the one you often get, is technology. And obviously, there's huge differences in technology between the ancient world and today. But I think some of the more interesting stuff is a little bit more amorphous things, more structural things. So I would say, first of all, childhood mortality. In the ancient world, and this is true of Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, really anybody up until about the Industrial Revolution, about 30 to 40% of kids died before they hit puberty. So I mean, put yourself in the place of an average inhabitant of the ancient world. If you were an ancient person, 3 or 4 of your kids probably would have died. You would have buried your children. And nowadays, we think of that as an unusual thing. And just psychologically, that's a huge thing. You would have seen multiple of your siblings die. If you were a woman, for example, if you were lucky enough to make it to, let's say, age 13, you probably would have to give birth 4 or 5 times in order just to keep the population from dying out. So those kind of grim mortality statistics, I think, are a huge difference, psychologically, between the ancient world and the modern. But fundamentally, do you think human nature changed much? Do you think the same elements of what we see today, fear, greed, love, hope, optimism, and the cynicism, the underlying forces that result in war, all of that permeates human history? Crude answer, yes. I think human nature is roughly constant. And for me, as an ancient historian, the kind of documents that I really like dealing with are not the traditional literary sources, but they're the things that give us those little glimpses into everyday life. So stuff like tombstones or graffiti, or just something that survives on a scrap of parchment that records a financial transaction. And whenever I read some of those, I'll have this moment of, feeling.